So we just finished discussing the ideas surrounding the invocation of state responsibility, and we'd come to this idea that injured states are entitled to have recourse to countermeasures. So let's talk about countermeasures a little further. What I want to talk about here is a basic definition of countermeasures, who can take countermeasures, the preconditions for countermeasures. You can't just have direct recourse to them. The form of action you can take as a countermeasure, and limits on the type of action you can take as a countermeasure. So the basic concept is that under limited circumstances, states may take unilateral action to secure their rights. So the principal form of such self-help is taking countermeasures, the suspension of performance of an international obligation by an injured state in order to induce a wrongdoing state to resume compliance with their legal obligations. So it's a form of self-help. It's doing something which would not otherwise be legally justified in international law, and you're doing it to induce a wrongdoing state to resume compliance. So it's not a form of punishment, it's an attempt at enforcement, and we'll come back to some of the consequences that has. Now, as we've said, under the ILC articles, it's only injured states who can take countermeasures, and you might think that that leaves certain erga omnes obligations or jus cogens obligations difficult to enforce if we have this narrow concept of injured states. But anyway, under the articles as we have them, there is a reference to Article 50 in Article 54 of the ILC Articles on State Responsibility that essentially says the articles are without prejudice to the circumstances in which non-injured states might be able to take action in respect of breaches of peremptory obligations of international law. So Article 54, as it were, is a without prejudice clause. It leaves the door open to the idea that there might already be such a customary international law rule, or that one might develop. So there is some state practice suggesting that states resort to economic sanctions where there are significant human rights breaches. There is not a lot of state practice supporting, for example, military intervention to enforce human rights, as we talked about in our use of force classes. Alright, what are the preconditions? What do you have to do before you can invoke countermeasures? You have to call upon the responsible state to comply with its obligations. You have to give notice that you are going to take countermeasures, and you have to offer to negotiate. However, those three steps are without prejudice to your ability to take urgent measures to preserve your rights. The other point here is that you must, the countermeasures must cease with the wrongful conduct or when the dispute comes before a court or tribunal. So the type of measures you take, therefore, have to have certain characteristics. So let's come to the forms of action you can take. So for a start, you are limited to the non-performance of an obligation, and it need not be of the same type. So if one state breaches an air services agreement about airport landings, you're not limited to taking action in relation to air traffic. You might take action under another obligation or another agreement. Countermeasures can only be directed at the responsible state. You can't direct them more broadly. And countermeasures must be readily reversible because, as we've said, the action you take has to end with the wrongful conduct. So you need to be able to resume compliance with obligations yourself once you've induced compliance with obligations in the other party. And that reinforces the idea that the object of countermeasures is to induce compliance. It's not punishment. Limitations. What are the limits on countermeasures? You must refrain from the threat or use of force. You must respect fundamental human rights. You cannot take action in reprisal, so that's essentially punishment, but particularly punishments directed at the civilian population. And countermeasures must be proportionate, and they can be proportionate with the original injury suffered, with the nature of the wrongful act, not the wrongful act as I have it there, or with the rights in question. So non-forceful, respect for human rights, no reprisals, and they must be proportionate. And that concludes what I want to say about countermeasures.